Hello, everyone, and welcome to Midnight Whispers. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin. Story 1. The Cemetery That Didn't Want Me There. I catalog cemeteries for researchers, which is a sentence that usually makes people pause before they ask questions. Most imagine it as quiet, respectful, maybe even peaceful work, and for the most part, that's true. It involves walking row by row, photographing headstones, recording names, dates, symbols, family plots, and small details most people walk past without ever noticing. It's methodical work, and it requires patience. You spend long hours alone, often in very old places, surrounded by the dead and the stories they left behind in stone. Because of that, you get used to being alone. You get used to silence. You get used to the feeling of being watched without actually being watched. Over time, you learn to separate what's just your imagination from what's genuinely strange. Most days are completely uneventful, but every once in a while, something happens that stops you in your tracks, something you can't quite explain, no matter how hard you try. The funniest and strangest thing that's ever happened to me happened while I was doing exactly what I always do. I was in an older cemetery, working my way through a section of headstones. I was taking photos, checking inscriptions, making sure I had clear images to work with later, when I'd be cross-referencing records during the winter months. It was late in the day, the light was starting to fade, and I wanted to finish just a few more stones before heading out. I was wearing jean shorts with a belt. I'm female, and I have a fairly decent-sized backside, so my pants are not the kind that just slip down on their own. Gravity and body shape alone make that unlikely. I was standing there, lining up a photo of a headstone, focused on the camera screen, when suddenly my shorts were pulled down. There's really no other way to describe it. They didn't slide. They didn't sag. They were pulled, just enough to be unmistakable. I froze for a second, my brain scrambling to catch up with what had just happened. My first thought was that I'd somehow snagged them on something, but there was nothing behind me. No branch, no wire, no fence. I was standing on open ground. The belt was still buckled. Nothing about it made sense. I pulled my shorts back up immediately and stood there feeling ridiculous and unsettled at the same time. I looked around, half expecting to see someone laughing at me, even though I knew I was alone. There was no one, just rows of headstones, quiet and still, exactly as they had been moments before. I decided that was a good place to stop for the day. It was getting late anyway. And once that uneasy feeling settles in, it's usually best to listen to it. As I was packing up my camera and taking one last look at the headstone I'd been photographing, I noticed the inscription more clearly. It was for a 12-year-old boy who had died of tuberculosis. Standing there, feeling a mix of nerves and disbelief, so I couldn't help but laugh a little to myself. I told myself that if anything odd had happened, maybe it was just a bored kid who thought it would be funny to mess with me. It was the only way my brain could make sense of it without spiraling into something darker. Humor helps. It always has. That wasn't the only strange thing I've noticed over the years, though. Animals behave differently in older cemeteries. That's something you start to notice once you spend enough time in them. It's not always dramatic, but it's consistent enough to stand out. Sometimes animals will follow you from headstone to headstone, staying just far enough away to keep you aware of them. It feels less like curiosity and more like observation, like they're trying to figure out what you're doing and why you're there. Occasionally, an animal will get aggressive in a way that feels oddly targeted. A squirrel will sit on a headstone and chatter angrily as you approach, refusing to move even when you get close. Birds will swoop or scream, perching directly on the stone you're photographing as if guarding it. It's not every cemetery, and it's not every visit, but it happens often enough that I've learned to pay attention when it does. I don't interpret it as something supernatural exactly. Animals are sensitive to environments, to changes, to patterns. Older cemeteries are different from parks or modern burial grounds. They're quieter, less maintained, and more layered with history. I sometimes wonder if animals simply recognize them as spaces where humans behave differently, where we slow down, move carefully, and focus intently on small details. Still, there are moments when the behavior feels personal, like I'm intruding on something. Photography brings its own set of strange experiences. I take a lot of photos when I'm out, hundreds sometimes, so that I can work through them later when weather or daylight isn't an option. Most of the time, the photos are clear and consistent. Same camera, same settings, same conditions. That's why it stands out when, for no obvious reason, a single image comes out blurry right in the middle of a perfectly clear sequence. It's not motion blur. It's not a focus issue that carries through several photos. It's just one image, right there in the middle, distorted or unfocused in a way that doesn't match anything before or after it. The lighting hasn't changed. My hands haven't moved. The stone hasn't shifted. And yet the image is unusable. It's frustrating from a practical standpoint, but it's also unsettling in a quiet way. You scroll through photo after photo, everything sharp and readable, and then suddenly there's one that looks like it was taken through water or fog. Then the next image is perfectly fine again. I've learned not to dwell on it too much, but it always makes me pause. Most of my work involves turn-of-the-century Catholic cemeteries, many of them primarily Irish. These cemeteries are often not under perpetual care, which means they don't receive ongoing maintenance the way modern cemeteries do. Grass grows wild, stones tilt and sink, and in some cases the ground itself can become unstable. During droughts especially, there's always the distant possibility of grave collapse. It's not common, and most of the graves that were going to collapse did so long ago, but it's something you're always aware of. You learn to watch where you step, to read the ground the way hikers read trails. Once, while I was working in one of my main research cemeteries, I met an older gentleman who stopped to talk. He was curious about what I was doing, and when I explained my work, his face lit up with recognition. He told me he had grown up near that cemetery when he was younger. What he shared with me that day stuck with me. He talked about how, when he was a boy, dogs from the area would sometimes come home carrying bones. Not sticks, not scraps from the woods. Bones that were clearly human. At the time, people didn't think too deeply about it. The cemetery was old. Graves had shifted. Erosion and time had done their work. It was unsettling, but it was treated as something unfortunate rather than something mysterious. The way he spoke wasn't dramatic. He wasn't trying to scare me. He was just sharing a memory, filling in a piece of history that wasn't written anywhere official. That cemetery had stories that never made it into records. Stories that lived only in the memories of people who grew up around it. He was incredibly helpful, pointing out areas that had changed over the years, sections that were older than they looked, and places where stones had been moved or replaced. He had a wealth of information, and I found myself hoping I'd run into him again someday. There was something grounding about the way he spoke, like he understood the past as something layered and complex rather than frightening. That conversation alone could be its own story. When you spend enough time cataloging cemeteries, you start to understand that they aren't just collections of graves. They're ecosystems of memory. They hold human history, environmental change, cultural habits, and personal grief all in one place. They attract strange moments, not because they're cursed or haunted in a dramatic sense, but because they sit at the intersection of time, loss, and attention. You're paying close attention in places most people pass through quickly or avoid entirely. You're noticing details. You're standing still. And sometimes, when you do that long enough, odd things happen. I don't walk into cemeteries expecting anything supernatural. I'm there to work. I respect the space, I do my job, and I leave. But I've learned that these places don't always behave the way you expect them to. They have their own rhythm, their own rules, and occasionally, their own sense of humor. Whether it's a pair of shorts being tugged at the worst possible moment, an animal acting like it has something to say, a photo refusing to cooperate, or a quiet conversation that opens a door to the past. Cemeteries have a way of reminding you that the line between the living world and everything that came before it isn't as solid as we like to think. Most days, it's just work. Other days, it's a reminder that history isn't dead and buried. It's right there under your feet, watching, waiting, occasionally reaching out, just enough to make sure you don't forget it's there. Story 2, I saw our dog in the yard after she died. I don't work around anything like that now, but hearing all of this brought back a memory I don't think about very often. It's one of those moments that sits quietly in the back of your mind, vivid and unchanged, even though years have passed. It wasn't dramatic or frightening in the usual sense. It was simple, ordinary, and somehow that's what makes it impossible to forget. It happened when I was a kid, on an afternoon that started out completely normal. I came home from school the same way I always did, dropped my bag, wandered through the house without really thinking about anything in particular. The day felt unremarkable, just another school day fading into evening. I remember heading toward the window that looked out into the fenced yard where our dogs usually went out. It was a familiar habit, almost automatic, the way you glance out a window without expecting to see anything unusual. That's when I saw Susie. She was in the yard, I moving slowly along the fence line. Not running, not sniffing around aimlessly, but walking with purpose, the way she always did when she wanted to be done with being outside. I remember noticing immediately that something felt off, but I didn't question what I was seeing. It made sense to me in that moment because Susie was Susie. She hated going outside. She would go out, do what she needed to do, and then waddle straight back toward the door like the yard itself offended her. She was unmistakable. Susie wasn't just any dog. She was fat, fluffy, and brown, with a very specific shape and presence that made it impossible to confuse her with any other animal. She had a round body, short legs, and the kind of waddle that came from carrying more weight than she probably should have. It wasn't subtle. You could recognize her from a distance just by the way she moved. There was no mistaking her for one of the other dogs, even in your peripheral vision. As I watched her moving along the fence, I felt confused. Not scared, just confused. It didn't make sense that she was still out there. She hated being outside more than anything. The yard was a place she tolerated, not enjoyed. Seeing her linger, walking slowly instead of hustling back to the door, struck me as odd enough that I turned and asked my grandmother about it without thinking. I remember asking, very casually, why Susie was still outside. I wasn't joking. I wasn't trying to be clever. I was genuinely asking a simple question based on what I could see with my own eyes. I even remember the exact phrasing, because it was such a natural, innocent moment. I pointed it out the way kids do, assuming the adults around them see the same things they do. My grandmother's reaction was immediate and sharp. She told me Susie wasn't outside. She told me Susie had died that morning. The words didn't register right away. There was a delay between hearing them and understanding what they meant. I remember feeling confused, then frustrated, because what she was saying didn't match what I had just seen. I insisted that Susie was out there. I knew what I saw. I could still picture her clearly, waddling along the fence line, her fluffy body moving exactly the way it always had. That's when I got in trouble. I was told to stop making things up. I was scolded for lying, for inventing stories, for saying things that weren't true. There was no room for discussion. I had no curiosity about what I might have seen. From an adult perspective, it was simple. The dog had died. A child was saying something strange. The conclusion was obvious. But the thing is, I wasn't making anything up. Even now, all these years later, the image is still clear in my mind. I can see the yard as it was then. I can see the fence, the angle of the light, and Susie's slow, unmistakable waddle as she moved away from the house instead of toward it. There was nothing vague or dreamlike about it. It didn't feel like imagination or memory blending into reality. It felt like seeing a dog in a yard, plain and simple. What sticks with me most is how ordinary it felt at the time. I didn't feel scared. I didn't feel shocked. I didn't feel like I was witnessing something impossible. I just felt confused that Susie was still outside, because that wasn't like her. There was no dramatic realization, no chill down my spine, no sudden awareness that something supernatural might be happening. Those feelings came later, after I learned she had already died. Looking back, that simplicity is what makes it so unsettling. If I had imagined it, I think it would have been fleeting or exaggerated or tied to emotion. But this wasn't that. It was calm, observational, almost boring in its normalcy. That's not how imagination usually works, especially in kids. When children invent things, they tend to be colorful or exaggerated or obviously playful. This wasn't playful. It was just there. Susie was my uncle's dog, and she had always been a presence in the house. Not the most energetic or affectionate dog, but memorable in her own way. She took up space, both physically and emotionally. When animals like that die, there's usually a noticeable absence, a quiet that feels wrong. That day instead of absence, I saw continuity. I've thought about it many times over the years, and trying to explain it to myself in ways that don't require anything supernatural. Maybe my brain filled in something familiar because I expected to see her. Maybe my memory reconstructed the moment after the fact. Maybe grief, even indirect grief, can do strange things to perception. All of those explanations sound reasonable, especially when spoken out loud, but none of them erase the image. I didn't know she had died when I saw her. There was no emotional trigger yet. No reason for my mind to conjure her up. The timing matters. The fact that it happened before I knew anything was wrong is the part I can't quite file away neatly. Animals, especially pets, become part of the background of our lives. They're constants. You don't consciously register their presence most of the time because they're always just there. When that presence suddenly ends, it leaves a gap that feels bigger than you expect. Sometimes I wonder if that gap doesn't close as neatly as we think it does. Maybe animals, like people, leave behind impressions. Not in a dramatic, ghostly way, but in the quiet routines they followed every day. The yard Susie hated, the fence she walked along, the path she took. Those patterns were carved deep enough into daily life that for a moment they continued on their own. Or maybe, just maybe, she was saying goodbye. I don't say that lightly, and I don't say it with certainty. I just know that if there's any creature capable of lingering out of habit or attachment, it would be a dog. Dogs are creatures of routine, loyalty, and place. They attach themselves to spaces as much as to people. The yard, the fence, the house, those things were part of her world. It's interesting to me that I didn't see her come toward the door, the way she always did when she wanted back inside. She was walking away, along the fence line, as if following some invisible boundary, or completing a final loop of familiar territory. That detail has always stayed with me. I also think about how quickly the moment was shut down. Being told I was lying. Being corrected instead of listened to. That response taught me something early on, not just about grief, but about how experiences like this are handled. There was no space for curiosity, no allowance for the possibility that something unexplained had happened. It was easier to call it imagination and move on. And so I did. I stopped talking about it. I tucked the memory away and carried it quietly, the way children often do when they realize adults don't want to hear certain things. But even as I grew older, the memory didn't fade or soften. It stayed exactly the same, unchanged by time or reinterpretation. What makes me think about it now is how similar it feels to other stories I've heard about people seeing loved ones or pets shortly after they pass. There's a consistency to those stories that's hard to ignore. They're rarely dramatic. They're usually brief, ordinary, and deeply personal. A glimpse, a sound, a familiar movement. Just enough to be recognized, and then gone. I don't know what that means. I don't know if it was my mind, my memory, or something else entirely. I don't know if animals linger the way people sometimes seem to, or if the human brain's just very good at preserving what it loves. I only know that when I think back on that day, I don't remember confusion or fear as much as I remember certainty. I knew that dog. I knew her shape, her color, her movement. I knew her habits and her dislikes, and what I saw matched all of that perfectly. It wasn't symbolic. It wasn't abstract. It was Susie, waddling along the fence, exactly as she always had. Getting in trouble for it didn't change what I saw. It just taught me to keep it to myself. Even now, when I picture her, I don't picture her as sick or dying or gone. I picture her exactly as she was that day, fat and fluffy and stubbornly moving along the fence line, doing one last lap of a place she never liked very much but still belonged to. And maybe that's all it was, or maybe it was more. Either way, it's a memory I carry with a strange kind of affection. Not sadness, not fear, just a quiet sense that some goodbyes don't happen the way we expect them to. Sometimes they happen so gently, so normally, that we don't even realize what they are until much later. I can still see that fat little dog waddling around the yard, and no amount of time or scolding or logic has ever managed to take that away. Story 3. The Man Who Said, someone was waiting for him. This call has stayed with me in a way I didn't expect, mostly because it didn't fit into any category I was comfortable with at the time. I had never been someone who believed in ghosts, spirits, angels, or anything supernatural. I was practical, trained to look for causes, symptoms, explanations. Things either had a reason or they didn't. And if they didn't, then it was usually because we hadn't found the reason yet. We were dispatched for an elderly man with a medical complaint. Nothing dramatic in the notes. Police were already on scene and wanted him checked medically. In small towns, that's not unusual. Cops will call EMS for things that feel even slightly off, especially with elderly residents who live alone. It's part concern, part community caretaking. When we arrived, the man was sitting in an easy chair in his living room. He looked to be in his 80s, thin, frail, but not visibly in distress. He lived alone, according to the officers. No family nearby. The house itself was quiet, dimly lit, and carried that heavy stillness you sometimes feel in homes where someone spends a lot of time alone. We did our assessment. Vital signs were normal. Blood pressure was fine, heart rate steady, oxygen levels normal. No signs of stroke, no chest pain, no shortness of breath. He was oriented, knew who he was, where he was, what day it was. From a medical standpoint, there was no obvious emergency. But the man was clearly worried. He kept stressing that there was someone in the back room, not casually, not as a passing comment. He came back to it again and again. He would answer our questions, cooperate fully, and then circle right back to it. Someone is in the back room. There's someone back there. They're there right now. The police officers told us they had already checked the house. They said there was nobody else inside. Doors were locked. No signs of forced entry. No movement. Nothing. Still, the man wouldn't let it go. There was something about the way he said it that made my skin crawl a little. It wasn't frantic or hysterical. It was insistent, almost resigned. Like he wasn't trying to convince us of something outrageous, but simply stating a fact that we were refusing to accept. I decided to go back there myself. The back room was unsettling the moment I stepped into it. It wasn't just empty space or a storage room. It was a child's bedroom, fully set up, a small bed, toys, some decorations. Everything arranged carefully, like it had been kept that way on purpose. Not dusty, not abandoned, just there. What made it worse was the context. This man was in his 80s. According to the police, he had no family in the area, no kids living with him, no grandchildren visiting. There was no logical reason for a child's room to exist in that house, especially one that looked maintained. I didn't see anyone in the room, no movement, no sound. But the atmosphere was heavy in a way that's hard to put into words. It felt wrong. Not scary in a movie sense, but deeply uncomfortable. Like you're somewhere you're not supposed to be. I went back and reported that there was no one physically present. We offered to take him to the hospital. Not because we had found a clear medical issue, but because sometimes being in a monitored, safe environment is the best option when something doesn't feel right. We explained it calmly. I told him it could just be for observation, for peace of mind. He refused. He was polite but firm. He didn't want to go. He just wanted us to understand that there was someone in the other room. He signed an AMA refusal. From a protocol standpoint, he was within his rights. He was alert, oriented, and medically stable. There was nothing we could legally force, so we left. I remember walking out of that house feeling unsettled in a way I couldn't quite explain. I'd been in plenty of uncomfortable homes before. Poverty, neglect, hoarding, violence. This was different. There was a tension in the air that didn't lift when we stepped outside. I told myself it was just one of those calls that sticks with you for no clear reason. The next shift, I ran into the same police officer who had called us out the night before. Small town, same faces, same calls. She brought it up before I did. She told me they had gone back to the man's house the following day for a wellness check. Not because there was new information, but because something about the call hadn't sat right with her either. Small-town cops do that kind of thing. Courtesy checks. Human checks. They knocked. No answer. They ended up breaking the door open. They found him sitting in the same easy chair, exactly where he had been when we left. He was dead. No signs of a struggle. No obvious trauma. Just gone. He had passed some time after we left, quietly, alone, in that chair. Other than his insistence that someone was in the back room, there had been no indication of a medical emergency. No warning signs we could act on. No symptoms that would have justified forcing him to go with us. Hearing that hit me harder than I expected. I started replaying the entire call in my head. His voice, his insistence, the way he wasn't confused, just certain. The feeling in the house, the child's room. All of it took on a different weight after the fact. Up until then, I didn't believe in ghosts or angels or anything waiting on the other side. But I had read stories, even dismissed them about people seeing things as they approached death. Loved ones who had already passed. Figures at the end of the bed. Presences no one else could see. The idea was always that the dying were hallucinating, or that their brains were misfiring. Standing in that house and then hearing how it ended made it harder to brush off so easily. From what I've read since, there are beliefs across many cultures that when a human is preparing to die, the veil thins, that they can see things we can't. Spirits, angels, guides, or, depending on belief, something darker. I don't know what I believe now. I only know that the feeling in that man's house was hair-raising. Not because of jump scares or obvious threats, but because of a deep sense that something was already there, waiting. Later on, my partner told me something that added another disturbing layer to the whole thing. He said the man had a history, that he had spent a great deal of time in jail in the past, that he was a known child molester. Suddenly, the child's room made a horrifying kind of sense. That knowledge didn't bring clarity or comfort. It made everything worse. The room, the fear, his insistence that someone was in there. It shifted the narrative in a way I wasn't prepared for. Yeah, if there is such a thing as angels that come to guide the dying, then what does that mean for someone who lived a life like that? And if there are demons or manifestations of guilt, or consequences waiting at the end, then maybe what he was seeing wasn't there to comfort him. Maybe it was there to collect. I'm careful with that thought, because it's easy to project judgment onto unexplained experiences. But the contrast between his calm demeanor and his absolute fixation on that back room makes it impossible for me to dismiss entirely. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't delusional in the usual sense. He was afraid, but not confused. He knew something was there, and he didn't want to face it alone. I still don't claim to believe in the supernatural the way some people do. I'm not suddenly convinced that every unexplained thing has a paranormal explanation. But that call cracked something open for me. It introduced doubt where there had been certainty. I've been on plenty of calls where people die unexpectedly. Most of them make sense after the fact. This one doesn't. Medically, procedurally, Emotionally, it sits in a gray space I don't have a box for. What haunts me isn't just that he died. It's that in his final hours he was aware of something we couldn't see. Whether it was a manifestation of his own mind, a lifetime of guilt surfacing at the end, or something genuinely beyond our understanding, I can't say. I just know that when we left that house, we left him with whatever was in that back room. And the next day, he was gone. Sorry to interrupt for just a moment. If you're new here, consider subscribing to Midnight Whispers for daily true horror stories that stay with you long after they're told, quietly unsettling and meant for the late hours. You can also turn on notifications so you're always here when a new story arrives and the night begins to stir again. Now, let's continue. Story 4. I woke up with a word written on my shirt. I haven't worked in hospitals or morgues myself, but this all happened when my mom was dating a guy years ago, and it's one of those periods of my life that feels frozen in time because of how strange it was. We had moved into his mother's house for a while. The house itself was massive, the kind of place where footsteps echo and rooms feel farther apart than they should. Even before anything happened, it had a presence. Not necessarily a bad one at first, just a sense that the house had lived a long life and remembered it. His mother's name was Carla. She was older, sharp in her own way, and very much tied to that house. At one point, she fell and broke her hip. After that, everything went downhill fast. Her health declined rapidly, and it felt like once she started slipping, she never really stabilized again. She passed away not long after, right around Halloween time, which only added to how surreal everything felt afterward. Not long after she died, we were all together in the kitchen carving pumpkins. My mom's boyfriend's kids were there, laughing, making a mess, doing normal kid stuff. The house felt lively in that moment, loud and warm, full of movement. When we finished, I walked out of the kitchen and into the hallway without thinking about anything in particular. That hallway led toward the back of the house where the stairs went down to the back door and the basement. As I looked down the hall, I saw Carla. I didn't see a shape or a shadow. I didn't catch something out of the corner of my eye. I saw her clearly, walking away from me, moving down the hallway toward the stairs. She was wearing a white dress. She didn't look sick or injured. She didn't look transparent or distorted. She looked whole. I froze where I stood and just watched her. She turned the corner at the end of the hallway and began going down the basement stairs. It happened slowly, calmly, like she had done it 1,000 times before. There was nothing threatening about it, nothing dramatic. It felt almost mundane, which somehow made it more unsettling. Once she disappeared down the stairs, my brain finally caught up with what my eyes had seen. I went to check. I walked down the hall, turned the corner, and went toward the stairs. There was nobody there. The basement was empty, silent, normal. I went straight to my mom and her boyfriend and told them exactly what I'd seen. I wasn't hysterical. I wasn't trying to scare anyone. I was shaken, but mostly confused. I described Carla walking down the hall. I described the white dress. Both of them went pale. They told me the dress I described was her wedding dress from her first husband. I hadn't known that. I didn't know what her wedding dress looked like. I didn't even know where it was kept. That reaction is burned into my memory, because it was the moment I realized this wasn't something I could just shrug off as imagination. Whatever I had seen matched something real, something specific, without me having any prior knowledge of it. It's been almost 10 years, and I can still see it clearly. The hallway, the way she walked, the white fabric, the turn at the stairs. That memory has never faded or softened. After Carla died, there was one room in the house that never felt right to me again. the library. She had died in that room. Every time I entered it, I felt watched. Not jump scare watched, not panicked watched. Just that heavy awareness that someone else was present even when I knew I was alone. It didn't matter what time of day it was. The feeling was constant. I avoided that room whenever I could, and when I couldn't, I never stayed longer than necessary. That house had more than one moment that made your skin crawl. Another time, my mom had a friend over. We'll call her Bailey. She brought her little kids with her, both around 5 or 6 years old. The house was full again, noisy in a good way. We were all sitting in the living room playing a card game, relaxed and distracted, not thinking about anything spooky or strange. Out of nowhere, one of the kids, the little girl, started screaming, not crying. Screaming! She pointed straight toward the library and said she saw a face in there. Everything stopped. The game ended instantly. Adults tried to calm her down. I asked her what she meant, but she was genuinely terrified. She wasn't joking, and she wasn't playing it up for attention. The look on her face was pure fear. Nothing else happened that night. No confirmation, no second sighting. But the mood never recovered. Everyone was creeped out for the rest of the evening. Kids see things sometimes. People say that. But when you're in a house like that, with a room no one feels comfortable in, it hits differently. The last experience in that house is the one that unsettled me the most on a personal level. This happened before Carla died. I was upstairs in my bedroom sitting at my computer playing a game. Everything was normal. No storms, no plumbing issues, no noises. Then, out of nowhere, I felt liquid dripping onto my arm. Then my hair, not a mist, not a single drop. Enough that part of my hair actually became soaked. I remember the sensation clearly, the coldness of it against my skin. I looked down and could feel that my arm was wet. My hair was wet. I looked up at the ceiling. There were no wet spots, no stains, no cracks, no pipes, nothing that would explain where liquid could be coming from. The ceiling was completely dry. I freaked out and ran downstairs to tell my mom. By the time I reached her, maybe a minute later, my arm was dry. My hair had dried almost completely. There was just the slightest hint of dampness left at the very ends of a small section of hair. Because I wasn't visibly wet anymore, she didn't believe me. From her perspective, there was nothing to see. No water, no leak, no evidence. From mine, I knew exactly what I had felt. I knew my hair had been soaked. I knew liquid had dripped onto me from nowhere. And I knew it had dried in an amount of time that didn't make sense. That moment seriously spooked me. I couldn't explain what the liquid was. It didn't smell like anything. It didn't leave a residue. It wasn't sticky or oily. It was just wet and then gone. I never felt comfortable in that room again after that. Even sitting at the same desk, playing the same game, the space felt wrong, like something had crossed a boundary without my permission. Looking back on all of it now, what stands out to me isn't just the individual events, but the consistency of the feeling in that house. It wasn't chaotic or violent. It wasn't constantly terrifying. It was subtle, persistent. Like the house remembered Carla and hadn't quite let her go, or like something about that space made moments overlap in ways they weren't supposed to. I don't know what I believe about ghosts. I don't know if what I saw was Carla herself, a memory imprinted on the house, or my brain filling in gaps during a stressful time. I don't know if the liquid was something mundane that behaved in a way I couldn't explain, or something else entirely. What I do know is that those moments have stayed with me. They haven't warped or exaggerated over time. They haven't turned into dramatic retellings. They're just there, clear, fixed, unchanged. That house taught me that sometimes places carry more than furniture and walls. Sometimes they carry moments, people, and things that don't always leave when they're supposed to. And once you've lived somewhere like that, you never fully shake the feeling that the line between normal and unexplained is thinner than you'd like to believe. Story 5, I saw her walking after she had already died. I love this story because it sits exactly in that uncomfortable space I live in mentally. I don't really believe in this kind of stuff, not in a committed way, but I want to. I find ghosts, apparitions, and all of it genuinely fascinating. At the same time, I'm a hardcore skeptic by instinct. I'm the type of person who could be actively dragged down a hallway by something transparent and whispering my name, and I'd still be thinking, there's got to be a reasonable explanation for this. That mindset usually saves me from spiraling, but every now and then something happens that just doesn't cooperate. This was one of those times. For context, I don't work around death. I don't live in an old haunted house. There was no emotional trigger, no recent loss, no expectation of anything strange. This was an aggressively normal situation, which is probably why it hit me so hard. It started with something incredibly mundane. I bought a pack of plain white t-shirts, the kind you wear as undershirts or around the house. No logos, no graphics, no writing, no designs, just basic white cotton shirts, straight out of the package. I remember that clearly because I'm picky about that kind of thing. I don't like surprise prints or anything decorative on shirts I plan to sleep in. That day, I put one on and wore it all day. Nothing unusual happened. I went about my normal routine, felt fine, didn't notice anything off, physically or mentally. By the evening, I was tired in the normal way people get tired after a long day, nothing alarming. I ended up falling asleep on the couch in my clothes, which I do sometimes without thinking much about it. The sleep itself wasn't strange. No weird dreams, no sleepwalking that I'm aware of, no interruptions. I just fell asleep and stayed asleep. When I woke up, though, something felt off. Not dramatically off, not I'm dying off. Just that heavy, sluggish feeling you get when your body is fighting something. I felt fatigued in a way that wasn't explained by how much I'd slept. Slightly sick, foggy. The kind of feeling where you don't immediately panic, but you also don't feel right. I got up, stretched, tried to shake it off, assuming I was just dehydrated or catching a minor bug. I went about getting myself moving, doing the usual morning things, still wearing the same clothes I'd slept in. At some point, I went into the bathroom and looked in the mirror. That's when I saw it. On the front of my shirt, in what looked like poor, uneven handwriting, was a word. It wasn't neat. It wasn't stylized. It looked like someone had written it quickly or without much care. The ink wasn't smeared, but it wasn't printed either. It looked handwritten. I froze, because I knew that shirt had been completely blank. My first thought wasn't paranormal. It wasn't even fear. It was confusion. My brain immediately started running through explanations. Maybe it was always there and I somehow missed it. Maybe the lighting made it look invisible earlier. Maybe it was some manufacturing defect that reacted to heat or moisture. But even as those thoughts came up, they didn't sit right. I looked closer at the word. It was something like doblado. I say something like because I don't remember the exact spelling with total certainty. But it was very close to that. Definitely not English. Definitely not something I recognized. I stared at it for a long time, trying to trigger recognition, but nothing came. So naturally, I started trying to decode it. My mind went to Spanish first, mostly because Hispanic cultures are often associated, fairly or unfairly, with a lot of folklore and spiritual symbolism. That wasn't a judgment, just an association my brain made in the moment. I thought maybe it was Spanish, maybe it meant something symbolic or metaphorical. I looked it up. Sure enough, it was Spanish. At first glance, the translation was underwhelming. The word translated to bent. That didn't mean anything to me. Bent how? Bent emotionally? Bent physically? Bent morally? It didn't connect to anything I was feeling or experiencing. I actually laughed a little at myself at that point, thinking, great, my mystery word is just bent. But something about that still bugged me. So I dug a little deeper. Instead of just using a quick translation, I looked it up in a Spanish dictionary to see if there were alternate meanings or contextual uses. Words often mean more than what a simple translation suggests. That's when things got uncomfortable. In certain contexts, the word was defined as describing a state of fatigue or sickness, not bent in a literal physical sense, but more like worn down, weakened, not at full strength, a condition rather than a shape. I remember just staring at the screen. Then I looked back at my shirt. Then I checked in with my body again. I was fatigued. I was sick. Not severely, but unmistakably. Enough that I had already noticed it before I ever saw the writing. Enough that I'd thought about it without attaching any meaning to it. And here I was, wearing a shirt that I was absolutely certain had been blank, now marked with a word I didn't recognize, written overnight, that directly described how I felt when I woke up. That's the moment my skepticism hit a wall. I didn't panic. I didn't feel like something was watching me. I didn't feel cursed or threatened. What I felt was deeply unsettled in a very specific way. It wasn't fear. It was the discomfort of not being able to line events up into a rational sequence. I tried to backtrack logically. Could I have written it myself? I don't speak Spanish well enough to casually write that word, especially in my sleep, especially in messy handwriting that didn't resemble my own. Could it have transferred from something else? There was nothing nearby with writing like that. Could it be a prank? I was alone. No one had access to me while I slept. Could it be some chemical reaction? Maybe heat, sweat, detergent residue, something invisible that reacted overnight? That explanation sounds reasonable until you consider the specificity of the word. Random chemical reactions don't usually form legible language, let alone in a foreign language that happens to describe your physical state. The more I tried to reason it away, the more strained the explanations became. And here's the thing that really gets me. If I were someone who desperately believed in the supernatural, I could have easily leaned into that. I could have framed it as a message, a warning, some kind of spiritual communication. But I'm not that person. I resist those interpretations almost automatically, which is why this one still bothers me. There was no emotional buildup, no expectation, no context that would prime my brain to invent something like that. It didn't happen in a spooky place. It didn't involve death, trauma, or belief. It happened on a couch, in a living room, in a plain white shirt. And that's what makes it so hard to dismiss. If it had been dramatic, I could have blamed adrenaline or fear. If it had been symbolic, I could have blamed imagination. If it had been vague, I could have blamed coincidence. But this was none of those things. It was specific, physical, and quietly exact. I'm still a skeptic. That hasn't changed. I still default to there has to be a reasonable explanation. But I've also learned that sometimes the explanation just doesn't show up, and pretending that it does just to protect your worldview feels dishonest. I don't know where the writing came from. I don't know why it appeared overnight. I don't know why it described exactly how I felt when I woke up. And I don't know why it hasn't happened again. What I do know is that it shook my confidence in the idea that reality always plays fair with our expectations. Sometimes something happens that doesn't announce itself as paranormal or spiritual or meaningful. It just happens quietly, leaves you holding a question, and walks away. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. Not that something unexplained happened, but that it didn't seem to care whether I believed in it or not. Story 6, we saw Confederate soldiers walking in our backyard. That house is one I still think about sometimes, even though we don't live there anymore and I'd rather not ever go back. At the time, it was just our home, nothing special on the surface. But from the beginning, there was something off about it, something that made the air feel heavier than it should have been. You don't always notice those things right away. Sometimes it takes years, or a single moment that finally clicks everything into place. Years later, maybe we found out the house had been built on top of a Confederate grave by mistake. Not intentionally, not marked. Just one of those things that got lost over time and ignored when the land was developed. By the time anyone realized, the house had already been there for years. Knowing that afterward made a lot of things make more sense, but at the time, we didn't have that context. We just knew things happened there that didn't feel right. The backyard was laid out in a strange way. Most of it was fairly flat, enough to play or walk around comfortably, but at the back it rose into a hill. The hill wasn't dramatic, but it was steep enough that you noticed it, especially when you stood at the bottom and looked up. It always felt darker up there, even in daylight, like the sun didn't hit it the same way it hit the rest of the yard. One day, my mother and I were outside together. It was daytime, not dusk or night. Which is important because it rules out a lot of easy explanations. We weren't tired, we weren't distracted, and we weren't talking about anything remotely spooky. We were just standing there, looking out toward the hill. That's when we saw them. 2 Confederate soldiers were walking up the hill. They weren't shadows or vague shapes. They were clear enough that we could see what they were wearing. They were dressed in old uniforms, and each of them was holding a musket. They moved slowly, deliberately, like they were patrolling the area rather than wandering aimlessly. Their movements felt purposeful, routine, as if this was something they had done countless times before. Neither of us spoke at first. I remember that silence more clearly than anything else. It was the kind of silence that happens when your brain is trying to decide whether what you're seeing is real or not. Then my mother said something, quietly, along the lines of asking if I saw it too. I told her I did. We described the same thing to each other without prompting. The same number of men, the same direction, the same weapons. And then they were gone. They didn't fade or dissolve. They just moved out of sight as they crested the hill, and that was it. The yard looked normal again, empty and still. We stood there for a while afterward, neither of us really knowing what to say. It wasn't terrifying in a screaming, panicked way. It was unsettling in a deep, slow way, the kind that sinks in later when you replay it in your head. We didn't tell many people about that. When you see something like that, especially with another person who confirms it, You don't rush to announce it. You sit with it. You wonder if there's some explanation you're missing. You tell yourself maybe it was a trick of light or your eyes playing games. But that explanation gets harder to accept when two people see the same thing at the same time. That wasn't the only thing that happened in that house. Another experience stands out just as clearly, maybe even more so because of how personal it felt. It was late at night, well past the point where the house had settled into its quiet state. My brother and I were sleeping in the same room. Nothing unusual about that. We'd done it plenty of times before. The room itself wasn't particularly large, but it always felt colder at night, even when the rest of the house was warm. There was an old wooden chair in that room that came with the house. It wasn't something we brought with us. It was already there when we moved in. It didn't match the rest of the furniture, and it always felt out of place, like it belonged to another time entirely. It was one of those chairs you notice even when you're not thinking about it. At some point during the night, I woke up. I don't remember why. I don't remember a noise or a dream pulling me out of sleep. I just remember opening my eyes and becoming instantly aware that something was wrong. My body felt heavy. That familiar weight that comes with sleep paralysis. I've experienced it before, so that part wasn't new to me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could only look. And there he was. A man was sitting in that old wooden chair. He was wearing a hat, the kind you don't see much anymore. Not a modern baseball cap or anything like that. Something older. He wasn't slouched or relaxed. He was sitting upright, facing my direction. His posture was calm, but his presence was overwhelming. It felt like all the air in the room had been pulled toward him. What disturbed me most wasn't just that he was there. It was the way he looked at me. It felt like he was staring directly into my soul. That's not an exaggeration or dramatic way of putting it. His gaze felt heavy and invasive, like he wasn't just looking at my body lying there, but at everything underneath it. My thoughts, my fear, my awareness. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I wanted to scream or wake my brother, but my mouth wouldn't move. I told myself it was sleep paralysis. I told myself that this was exactly the kind of thing people describe when they have it. A figure in the room, a sense of being watched, a presence that feels intelligent and aware. All of that fit. I clung to that explanation because it was the only one that made any sense in that moment. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep or snapped out of it because the next thing I remember is morning light and the room looking normal again. The chair was empty. Everything was where it was supposed to be. I didn't say anything at first. Later that day, my brother brought it up. He asked me if I had seen something in the room the night before. My stomach dropped. He described a man sitting in the chair, a man with a hat. A man who didn't move, who just sat there and watched. He didn't know about my sleep paralysis at the time. He wasn't trying to connect it to anything. He was just unsettled and wanted to know if I'd noticed it too. That's the part that still messes with me. Sleep paralysis can explain a lot. I'm willing to accept that my experience could have been shaped or even entirely created by that. But it doesn't explain how my brother, who was sleeping in the same room, described the same thing. He wasn't paralyzed. He wasn't half awake in the same way. He saw something too. We didn't talk about it much after that. There's a point where you realize talking doesn't make things clearer. It just makes them heavier. The house already felt wrong. That experience added another layer to it. Over time, more little things happened. Nothing as clear as the soldiers or the man in the chair, but enough to keep that sense of unease alive. Sounds with no source. The feeling of being watched when no one was around. Rooms that felt colder or darker than they should have been. You learn to live around those things when you don't have a choice. When we eventually moved out, there was a sense of relief that I didn't fully understand until later. It wasn't just leaving a house. It was leaving something behind. Whatever that place held, whatever history was tied to it, we were no longer in the middle of it. Finding out later about the Confederate grave only reinforced that feeling. It didn't prove anything in a concrete way, but it added context. That land had a past, one that involved death, conflict, and people who never really left in the way we expect the dead to leave. I don't claim to know what we saw. I don't know if the soldiers were residual energy, some kind of echo tied to the land. I don't know if the man in the chair was a product of my sleep paralysis that coincidentally matched what my brother experienced, or if it was something else entirely. I don't know if knowing about the grave would have changed how we interpreted things if we'd known sooner. What I do know is that the experiences were real to us. They weren't stories invented after the fact. They weren't shaped by belief or expectation. At the time, we didn't even have a framework for understanding them. They just happened, and we dealt with them as best we could. Some places don't feel neutral. Some places feel like they're holding on to something, whether that's memory, history, or something harder to define. That house was one of those places. Living there taught me that not everything fits neatly into explanations, and not every experience demands belief to be unsettling. All I know for sure is that we don't live there anymore, and I'm very okay with that. If you're still here, then these stories didn't simply fade away. They settled in. Every story you heard tonight came from real moments, real people, and real situations where something felt off or nearly went wrong. If you want to keep exploring stories that linger in your thoughts long after the night grows quiet, consider subscribing to Midnight Whispers. There are more stories waiting in the dark, and not all of them let you leave in time.